They have distinctive communities within the larger whole. That is to say, the novel consists of subgenres, right? The different colors here represent kind of internal structure to this thing called the novel, or this thing called third world literature. And understanding those smaller substructures is also an important part of the process. Now, one of the things that people often say is, well, look, that's all well and good, and that might work for science or medicine or sociology, but in literary studies, we don't generalize. That is to say, this quote from one researcher here is a pretty good example of arguments you'll often hear, which is that the humanities particularize. They focus on singular things and specific things. They don't generalize. And so I call this the particularism hypothesis. The particularism hypothesis, which is quite hard to say, says that we expect to find no or extremely low levels of generalization within humanities research. That is to say, if we do in fact highlight the singular, then we should not see generalization very prominently in our research. And so far, I've only been using examples. So how can we get confidence about how prevalent this problem of generalization is? Is generalization really a problem in literary studies? So what I'm going to walk you through now is the way we can use something like machine learning to answer this kind of question. And I'm going to rely on what I call the 5 steps of model building to try and walk you through this process. And this is something I've outlined in an article called Think Small that appeared in PMLA in 2017, and also in these pages in my book, Can We Be Wrong?, where I kind of outline for you how to build a model. And all of the kind of criteria and steps you want to go through when you sort of apply machine learning to analytical questions. And I'm going to walk you through those right now. So the very first step is definition. That is to say, we need to define our concept. And I've tried to do that a little bit so far using examples, right? So we can come up with this sort of broad scale definition of what a generalization is using a dictionary definition. The other thing we need to do is always bound our phenomena. That is to say, if you're interested in the novel, it means there's boundaries to the documents, right? You're interested in a document level phenomenon. If you're interested in generalization, well, you're interested in a discursive phenomena. And the question is, where are the boundaries of a generalization? And that's a very hard question actually to answer. In our project, we operationalize this as a statement level phenomena, meaning it's approximate to a sentence. That is to say, a generalization is something that's going to occur at the sentence level. That's not the only answer. One could imagine generalization happening at the paragraph level or at the article level. What is the general argument of an article, for example? But we model this as a statement level phenomena. Generalizations, as I've tried to show you, happen at the level of sentences like Jameson or like those other examples. The other important thing to emphasize here is what's happening is we're understanding our concept through examples. And this is a very both the power and limitation of machine learning is we can understand our problem and our question through example-based frameworks. In order for me to know what generalization is, I need to identify examples of generalization. And that's ultimately what the model will learn. What's powerful about that is I don't have to specify in advance a generalization uses these words or has this grammatical structure. What I need to do instead is use a higher level understanding of saying this sentence is a generalization. This sentence is not a generalization if I'm using a binary system. Or I could use a scalar system and say this sentence is a very strong generalization, so I give it a 5. This sentence is a very weak generalization, so I give it a 1 if you use a Likert scale. But the important thing is we're building our understanding off of examples. And so, again, here would be some more examples. And as we work through these examples, in order to be consistent about our identification of examples, we might want to begin to identify the stylistic qualities that we think are motivating our understanding of generalization and codify that. So generalization often uses a the noun will refer to some category, here literary study, and the verb will refer to often some kind of like effect or interaction. So literary study has been dominated, right? That's where we're defining our category through some action. So that's a positive example. Here, the entire society would be the subject of the sentence. And here again, it has been predicated on, right? So we're using a definitional. Here's a negative example where we see that this larger class, royal servitors, they simply did something, right? So it's more descriptive than it is generalizing. And again, these things are ambiguous. They're fundamentally ambiguous. And when we're dealing with literary categories, when we're dealing with textual categories, we are always in a realm of subjectivity and ambiguity. We cannot get rid of that problem. And one of the nice things is that we'll see using computational methods, using machine learning, is we can try and quantify and understand that ambiguity. Right? So we don't need to get rid of it, and we don't need to sort of throw our hands up and say everything's ambiguous. We can try and get a sense of how ambiguous is this problem when multiple people look at it. Okay, so I'll move on here. The next step is the step called selection. We need to select data to work on. Where are we going to try and run our models, and how are we going to make an estimation about the world at large? So what are the blue dots in my circle of gray dots? Where are the blue dots going to come from? And again, we have to be explicit as possible. So for our project, we followed the sampling procedure in the Open Science Collaboration article from 2015. If you don't know this article, I strongly recommend it. It was the sort of opening of the reproducibility crisis. That is to say, the piece that tried to replicate a whole bunch of studies in social psychology that ultimately proved only about half of them proved to be replicable. And there's a million details buried in the piece about how they did it, what they found, how reliable those findings are. But what they ultimately showed was there was a real crisis in many, many fields where findings that are achieved on small samples of people aren't reproducible in other settings with new samples of people. And that article gives you a very good framework if you're interested in the question of replication, of how to reproduce someone else's findings to ensure that that insight is accurate and true and holds. That they give you a very useful framework to how to do that. So we followed their sampling procedure, and we sampled 9 journals from a single year, all articles published in those journals. And we balanced our articles in the following way. That is to say, we took 3 from one category of literary studies, 3 from another category of literary studies, 2 history, and 1 sociology. In other words, we had sort of a 3-3-3 kind of model of literary studies broken down into 2 subcategories, and then not literary studies broken down between history and sociology. Here in the book, you can sort of see the breakdown of the number of articles we're looking at, the average length of the articles, how we coded them, et cetera, et cetera. This is to give you an idea. We're at about 230 articles that we're talking about that we sampled and that we studied, which is very important to keep in mind, is a very small cross-section of the entire field of literary studies. Nevertheless, it's also a very, the selection criteria are made prior to the study. Right? Jameson reads novels confirming what he wants to argue for, and he selects the ones that align with his argument. Here, we select articles prior to running our experiments, so we don't know if they will confirm our belief or not. Different samples may show different results. That's what you always have to assume. However, I would be very surprised given the sampling procedure we used. The next step is we need to annotate examples of generalization. So that's our data set. And within that data set, we need to begin to identify, as an expert in the field, what is a generalization and where is it happening? And then we need to get confidence that those things we've annotated are quality annotations, are reliable annotations. So what happened? Well, I spent the better part of a winter going through these articles and sampling sentences from them and annotating them for whether or not they were generalizations. And this is what a table looks like ultimately. And I used a binary model. A sentence either was a generalization or it was not a generalization. Again, that's a modeling choice. And if you were to do this project, you may want to argue that generalization is a scalar problem and see if you get different results that way. The next step we do is the validation of this annotation process. So what we want to know is, would anybody agree with me on my annotations, right? I am an expert annotator, and we decided to go with a single expert annotator and try and assess how other annotators might agree with my expert annotations. It was prohibitively expensive in terms of time and resources to get 4 people to annotate all. I think in the end I annotated 3,000 sentences. It was too much to ask other people to do that. So we had them do a small sample and then see how much agreement we could get between all of us. And this comes after lots of discussions about understanding the problem. So this isn't just sort of grab 3 random people off the street and ask them this question, right? This is trying to arrive at a consensus and then see how well we can agree on the annotation of generalization. And what you see here from these numbers, let me just walk you through what these numbers mean. The first column is how much do the other 3 readers, one of whom was a faculty member in a different discipline, and 2 of whom were students, how much did they, where they agreed with each other, right? When 2 of 3 of them agreed with each other, how much did they agree with my annotations? And what we see here is we're only about 65% accurate. That is, only in about 2/3 of cases did we actually agree with each other, meaning there's a high level of ambiguity surrounding this question and this problem. And that's very important and also okay. Right? We can build that ambiguity into our models. The next column is a demonstration of when I feed these examples, when I feed these 3,000 examples into a machine and use a process called cross-fold validation, how accurate can the machine be? How accurate can a machine learning classifier be in predicting things that I have annotated as generalizations versus things that I've annotated as not generalizations? And here you see the machine learning algorithm achieves a relatively decent accuracy of about 75%, meaning that in 3/4 of all cases, after learning what a generalization is based on my annotations, it's able to identify a generalization about 3/4 of the time, with about 75% accuracy. Okay, and depending on your project, you're going to want that number to be higher or lower. Right? If you're trying out a new drug on people and you want to be confident it doesn't kill them, then being 75% accurate is a very bad score. Right? But if you're dealing with human judgments about texts, in that case, where we assume there's a lot of intrinsic variability, then it's a pretty decent score. So this gives us a way of understanding how reliable are these annotations, considering that we're going to use them to make inferences about the world at large. So how do we then use these annotations for the process of predicting sentences out in the world? I was able to annotate 3,000 sentences. That took a lot out of me. I don't ever want to do it again. And that's only a small portion of the whole. So can we annotate more sentences using machine learning? That is to say, using a process that learns a representation of what a generalization is, and then go out and predict it out in the world. I've used this process for things like fictionality. Can we teach a machine whether a text is a work of fiction or not fiction? What can that tell us about the nature of fictionality, for example? So we can use machine learning as a way not simply of predicting and annotating texts, but also understanding them. And that's what's really crucial. So here we use a convoluted neural network, deep contextualized word representations on all of the sentences from our data set, which is about 16,000 sentences. And here you see the final performance. And for those of you who aren't comfortable with F1 scores and precision and recall, this is I'm teaching it, in fact, in about an hour in my class today. This is the most important set of metrics you need to learn. What does this mean? Well, I won't go into it for today and for interest of time, but this is a way of understanding how accurate our models are. And again, we're at about the 75% accuracy. Okay. What do we find? Right, so we do all of that in order to arrive at an insight about the prevalence of generalization in our field. And what we see is that, first of all, literary studies does behave differently than history and sociology with respect to generalization. And so that's what those box plots tell us. This is an estimate of the average amount of generalization in our sentences. However, when we look at the numbers, when we look at the y-axis, we see that they're incredibly close to each other in real terms. That is to say, our estimates are that if we look at the introductions and conclusions of articles from literary studies and from our literary studies sample, close to 1 out of every 2 sentences is a generalization. For history and sociology, it's a little over 1 out of 2, but they're only off by about 3 to 5 percentage points, which is a very small difference in real world terms. So let me just say that again. We estimate that 1 out of every 2 sentences in the introduction of a literary studies article is a generalization of the kind that I have tried to show you. In other words, the particularism hypothesis is not a very good hypothesis. We are generalizing at rates that approximate other disciplines that are much more quantitatively oriented than literary studies. In other words, we're using generalizations all the time. And this slide just gives you an example of the differential rates across journals. So journals like Critical Inquiry, authors generalize as much as, say, the American Sociological Review, whereas PMLA exhibits rates that are about over 10 percentage points on average, lower amounts of generalization, right? So that will amount to some difference in our experience. So suggesting that editorial policies can have an impact on the rates of generalization. So this slide for me is a place where we as scholars, as peer reviewers, as editors can intervene into this process of generalization and think about just how often are people making really outsized claims and what can we do about it? So it's fair to say we can reject the null hypothesis. Literary studies as a field generalizes with a great deal of regularity. So in the remaining kind of few minutes of the talk, what I want to focus on is how can we make more credible generalizations, right? I've shown you how machine learning can be used to estimate the amount of generalization, and we can use this same process for anything that we're interested in. We can use it around affect, emotion, fictionality, genre, style, whatever it is that you're interested in understanding, you can use machine learning for that process. But I'm interested in staying with this idea of generalization. How can we do it better? What can we learn? Even if we're not using machine learning, that is to say, even in a world of close reading, how can we generalize better? So what I'm going to walk you through here are just these final steps of what I call open generalization. Okay, and this is sort of the program I want us to get our heads around and really embrace as literary scholars. And it draws on principles that I think things like machine learning, computational analysis can teach us about how to be good generalizers. So the first is what I call the telos of generalization. Explain clearly what you aim to generalize about and how you are going to do it. Make it clear you are going to make empirical claims about some category in the world. Jameson makes it clear he's going to generalize about third world literature, okay? And that needs to be built into the article in the language. I am going to generalize about X here. Don't just try and like sneak it in or suddenly work your way up to it after an example. Really make it clear that your goal is generalization. The next step, however, is to say, okay, well, given that my goal is to generalize about this topic, I need to explicate the selection criteria of the works consulted. How many works did I consult? Why were they included? Which works did I not include? Which works did I not consult, right? When you go to an archive, you read a portion of that archive. What didn't you read and how might that matter and how might that impact? It's a lot harder to say, I'm going to make conclusions about third world literature when you then in a following up sentence say, and I read 20 of them. Right? The absurdity of that will suddenly become clear. And we've just repressed that truth, right? We've just put that down and ignored it and hidden it under the rug. And that needs to be surfaced. We need to be very explicit about which works we chose and why. What are the infrastructural and ideological backgrounds of these works? How did they get up? How did they land on my desk? Why did I choose to talk about Cervantes or Jane Austen, right? And always include negative examples. When you're talking about national allegories, as Jameson might, we need to understand which works are not national allegories. I mean, Jameson makes the crazy claim that every third world work of third world literature is a national allegory. But of course, some aren't. And we need to see what that looks like. What does the negative side of your insight, your generalization, look like? The third step is analytical transparency. So create clear and consistent criteria for judging each work or passage. That is to say, much of what we do as close readers and much of what we're trained to do is use very different judgment criteria every time we encounter a passage. We see a passage, we say all this interesting stuff about it. We move to the next passage, we say all this interesting stuff about it. We have no sense of the criteria that were used to engage with those judgments. And so what machine learning teaches us, what computational analysis teaches us, is that we need clear and consistent criteria for judging these works or passages in order to arrive at our generalization. What is a national allegory, and how will you know when you see it? It needs to be defined in advance, and the same criteria used over and over again. Another example that I can give you from my own research is I recently did a piece for the Journal of Cultural Analytics testing Pascal Casanova's hypothesis about minor literature. So she, in her book, The World Republic of Letters, is a very interesting book. And she's very interested in trying to argue that when you don't write in a cultural capital like Paris, then you're subjected to different stylistic criteria. You're going to write differently when you write in Iceland versus even in Madrid or Berlin and so forth. And she only selects books that align with our hypothesis. And so we redid the project with a random sample of books to try and see if her ideas hold. And what we find is the exact opposite. So the way she draws her conclusions and the stylistic criteria she says that minor literature needs to embrace is exactly flipped. Right? So that's an example of how learning to test and make consistent our criteria can really change our understanding of literature. And the other important criteria here is embracing uncertainty. I think as a field, we kind of have a double-edged relationship to uncertainty. On the one hand, we want to believe that what we're doing can be highly subjective and creative. On the other hand, we're very intolerant of error. When we see that 75% rate, we're like, well, what does the machine really know? And the idea is we can build in uncertainty into our understanding, and that to embrace the idea that our knowledge is conditional. Just because there's uncertainty doesn't mean it's invalid. And so, box plots are a great way to say, well, what's the range? What's the estimate range here that I can get on this problem? What I didn't show you is an example of how when we build in that error, the uncertainty grows and the rate of generalization, the estimate probably goes down to closer to like 35 or 40%. Right? So the estimate is going to change depending on how we build our models and how much uncertainty we allow for. But uncertainty becomes really crucial as part of our knowledge. Rather than say what Jameson does, which is all novels necessarily behave this way, we can embrace a more probabilistic understanding of the world. It is more likely the case that these novels behave this way, but it's by no means certain. And my understanding is conditional upon having looked at these works, having built a model in this way, et cetera, right? So making our knowledge highly conditional and embracing uncertainty. And the final point is what I call embracing a culture of limitation. Under what conditions are your conclusions valid? How limited are they in extending beyond what you have observed? And what conditions might challenge your conclusions? That is to say, if you define your problem differently, if you looked at different documents. So in the case of my project on generalization, would looking at a different sample of articles yield substantially different results? Maybe, I don't know yet, right? That's the process of replication. I suspect it won't, given that we have a fairly large random sample and there's not a whole lot of internal validity. Yes, we saw that certain journals behave differently than others. So we expect that number to move depending on which kinds of journals you sample. When you sample highly prestigious journals that are very general in their research focus, they generalize more. When you sample highly specific, domain-specific journals, they generalize less. Similarly, depending on how you build your models. So I annotated the data. We used a particular machine learning model. If we used a different machine learning model, or if someone else annotated the data or defined generalization differently, would we see different results, right? This is extremely important. What we know about this, phenomenon is conditional upon the ways in which I've constructed it. And that means every time we do a project, we have to lean into those limitations. I've never read a literary studies article that uses close reading that says, here are the limits of what we know because I've only read 5 novels, or my analysis is only based on certain passages of Jane Austen. It doesn't happen, but it needs to happen because it communicates to readers that there are serious limitations and serious conditions on the arguments being made. So if I were to conclude, to conclude, I would rewrite, right? We could rewrite Jameson in this way. Right? So instead of using words like sweeping and all and radically and necessarily, we can propose things like a tentative hypothesis to say that some third world cultural productions have in common and distinguishes them in certain to be specified ways. That is to say, in a way I'm going to define very rigorously and clearly in this paper, that some of them, whose selection I will define, are more likely to be allegorical in a way that I will subsequently define as a national allegory. This would be a Jameson who is embracing open generalization, as opposed to a Jameson who is embracing making very grand statements based on very little evidence. Okay, thank you everyone. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. So is there any question here?
Yeah, well, let me allow me. Thank you so much, Professor Piper. I will be moderating now, and I will be here in the audience. I will highlight some of your main ideas in Spanish, firstly, and secondly, we will go back to you with some questions, okay? Yeah. Para comentarlo un poquito en español, porque nos lo han pedido. Aperturó su charla el profesor Andrew Piper, precisamente citando a Frederick Jameson, y cerró su charla además con Frederick Jameson también, pero precisamente refiriéndose a cómo hablar de generalizaciones cuando estamos analizando textos del ámbito de las humanidades, sea literatura, sea sociología o sea historia. Y lo que ha pretendido, tenemos que decir que el profesor Piper, él estudió literatura, inglés y alemán, procede de la literatura y desde la literatura ha realizado un movimiento hacia lo que se llama data science, no para dejar la literatura, sino para estudiar y darle otro enfoque y otras perspectivas a los estudios sobre textos literarios, historia, sociología, etcétera, etcétera. Y en este caso él ha planteado aquí, unas ideas, ha seleccionado una serie de textos, de crítica, artículos publicados en revistas científicas del ámbito de la historia, de la literatura, si no recuerdo mal, y también la sociología, en un periodo de tiempo, para ver los niveles de generalización atendiendo a 5 criterios. Definición, define primero, selecciona las información, los data, select data, y luego lo más importante, la validación, es decir, vamos a validarlos, creo que lo he traducido bien, con otros criterios hasta llegar a unos resultados. Y finalmente, para cerrar, plantea también los límites de este tipo de estudios, que tenemos que estar abiertos y de hecho ha cerrado con una frase muy bonita que a mí me ha encantado, que dice que tenemos que abrazar la incertidumbre, embracing uncertainty, abrazar la incertidumbre, and embracing a cultural limitation. Tenemos que abrazar también las limitaciones culturales porque existen, ¿no? Y bueno, me ha encantado esa prudencia y esa honestidad científica. Y si queréis pasamos ya al turno de preguntas, que seguramente habrá preguntas muy interesantes en la sala. Tenemos a alguien en el chat, sí. Okay. Vale. Sí.
Multilingüismo, dado que ha hablado de literatura global y de generalización, su dataset está tomado del inglés o ha probado con otras lenguas que no sean inglés, porque los americanos siempre van a
Okay.
¿Cómo te decides?
Okay. Here is a question for you, Professor. The question is if you have worked with books in translated to English, or you have used the natural language. And I think that you have used English translations, yeah?
I think
Oops, sorry, you're muted. Oh, sorry, was there a follow-up question? You were muted.
Yeah. Yeah. ¿Del ordenador? Yeah. A la izquierda. Ahí. Yeah.
How, Mr. Piper? Nice to meet you. I have been listening to you very carefully, and I would like to ask you if you have worked with different languages in your appreciation about what is standardization, or if you have only considered the English canon.
Yeah, it's a good question, and as I mentioned at the outset, so this project relies exclusively on English language journals, and principally North American. So ones that are published in English, also published locationally in North America, either in the US, mostly in the US, I think not even in Canada. So I have not done that cross-lingual analysis. However, you know, anecdotally, I can say as a reader of German scholarship and regularly of German scholarship, I see this kind of behavior and these kinds of statements all the time within German scholarship. And my hypothesis would be that the results would not be strongly dependent on the national language or the national framework, but is more specific to the discipline. That is to say, Spanish literary studies should look like North American literary studies when it comes to the problem of generalization, just as it should also look like German literary studies or French literary studies. Now, since I don't have the evidence for you, we can't prove that, but I would be very surprised, given my reading and knowledge of these other fields, if we found some national distinctiveness there. In ways that, for example, when we're studying literary style, we would expect to see more variation between different cultures. Although, as I talk about in enumerations in my book, much of what we find about fictional discourse, I can replicate in either German or English. That is to say, there are some specific differences to German literature compared to English language literature, but there are also very strong commonalities. So your question is a good one because we need to move, as we move forward, we need to begin to think about cross-cultural comparisons for whatever our questions are. So that's a good thing to do. So thank you, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, more questions? Yeah. Yeah. Would you like to do it from here? I saw a hand. No? Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, hi, thank you very much for your talk. I have a question. I'm coming from a different field. I'm coming from computational linguistics. So I don't know whether my question is exactly relevant or not to literary studies, because I'm completely new to that. That's why my question comes in. So in my field, when we work with machine learning models, we have this problem with the bias. There's sort of bias implicit in the data, and there can be bias in the selection of the sources, but we have human bias in the data itself. So when we apply machine learning models, we have the risk of amplifying such a bias. I don't know the data that you work with, so I wonder, do you also have that problem? Do you see a risk that, especially if you work with generalizations, do you see that there is, by working with such an amount of data, massive data, do you have that problem in your field as well? And do you think there's something to draw attention to?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the principle that I was talking about with embracing uncertainty and conditionality is really important. That is to say, we know there's intrinsically going to be some bias in the data I selected, and also the annotations that I did. And as you say, the risk of machine learning is we scale that bias. So if I just say something about a novel, we know it's biased because it's my insights about that novel, and it doesn't scale. It's just stuck at that one novel. But if I make claims like Jameson that say, well, all third world literature behaves in this way, he has just done the scaling of machine learning. So it's important that in our research, we are like the machine learning scaling and the research scaling, they're actually operating on very similar planes. And what I'm talking about is being very cautious in our generalizations and uncovering where the bias can be and how much uncertainty there is due to the bias. So I for sure know that if you annotate a generalization, you would do it differently from me. And there would be some overlap in how we agree. And we could assess how much agreement there is, just like I did with those student annotators. So I asked them after we trained and we talked and we discussed, you annotate the same passages and let's see how much agreement. And we saw there was a considerable amount of disagreement, right? That there's only about 65% overlap between our judgments. So that's the bias, right? We can see how much bias there is in those annotations and we can quantify that. And what's nice is I can then put that into the model when I estimate prevalence. There's a formula I can use to say, well, given that much error, and we use this in medical testing, for example, we know a medical test makes mistakes. So given that much error, how many people do you think actually have this disease? And we can do the same thing with our judgments about annotating text. So given that much error, how many generalizations do I actually think are in the world? And that's what I was saying, that number will go down. So it'll go from about 50% to the high 30s because of so much error, where we would get less confident of that number, but it's still quite high, right? 1 out of every 3 sentences is still a lot of generalizations. So that's ways, and these methods are coming from computational linguistics. That's ways we can incorporate our knowledge of bias into the project. Similarly with sample bias, with the data we select, by showing how different journals behave in different types of journals, I can show that part of my results depend on which journals I choose. So those are biased in a particular way. However, those differences aren't so strong as to give me concern that, in fact, I would throw out the null hypothesis. I would say, people don't generalize in literary studies. There's no journal that exhibits that behavior, right? So yes, there's bias, but this is what I mean. Just because there's bias doesn't mean we can't make valid inferences about the world. Just because we know there's some ambiguity in my annotations and there's some bias in the data I've selected does not mean that we can be confident that generalization is a very common linguistic behavior, right? So the two don't nullify each other. They just give us a way of understanding where more work needs to be done.
Do we have another question? Yeah, well, I'd like to ask Professor Piper a question. You come from literature studies and languages, and I wonder if you consider that, well, humanities and literature in particular is not very much in the picture in the universities as a whole. And do you think that by using data science, applying to the studies of literature, humanities in general, will put us in front of the picture in the universities?
It's a great question, and one of the things that I guess we find comfort in shared misery. So the fact that there you are in Spain having the exact same problems that we have in Canada, that my colleagues in the US are having. It's a very common, I won't say worldwide, but for sure, people I know in Europe are experiencing the exact same thing as people in North America. Also in South American countries where I know people, the humanities are diminishing in their prominence within the university, and literary studies in particular. My particular areas, I work on foreign languages, so teaching German in Canada is even worse. Right? So if we go down the scale of decline and collapse, I'm very at the bottom. I'm at the close to extinction. And so I want to affirm that this is a very widespread problem, and it does not appear to be specific to a cultural context, right? We can't say this is because of Canadian students or voters, or because of American culture, or because of Spanish governmental priorities, right? This is happening in very different places. So there's something bigger going on. And for sure, I have no idea how to solve it. My argument is, my hypothesis is that yes, that data science is the single most important thing methodologically happening at the university across every discipline: medicine, social sciences, physics, natural sciences, you name it. We do well to embrace it, right? It makes sense to me that this thing that is becoming a lingua franca, it's becoming a powerful methodology across numerous disciplines, can also benefit us. I don't believe that people out in the world, whether in Spain or in Canada, I don't believe they don't care about literature. It's the opposite. People love to read books, right? They still love books. People read, books still sell. It's a big business. Fiction is important. If you extrapolate out, storytelling is important for television and so forth. The point is, I know that's important. What's happened is the way we've talked about that has diminished its credibility as a form of knowledge. That's hard to accept as someone trained in this stuff. I was initially a literary studies scholar. That's hard to acknowledge and accept. So I know that. However, I think we have an opportunity if we embrace digital methods, which are hard to learn, but I think is doable. If we embrace digital methods, we can really re-energize public investment, public belief, public support for studying literature. That's my pitch. And I think that's true, but we will see. We will see.
Thank you so much for your time and your wonderful speech. And we say goodbye here. And thank you so much again for your inspiring talk. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here.
Terminamos ya esta parte de la sesión y descanso hasta las 6:30, que y cuarto y media. Dolores Romero, Universidad Complutense. Sí, fantástico. Sí.
Bueno, ahora debería pasar. Vale, pasa bien, ahora sí que lo está. Ahora sí, a ver, ahora salgo. Vale. Es que